A lot of people refer to psychological trauma as though it's something that just occurs in the mind. But the way that I understand it is that it's our whole body that can be impacted. Trauma isn't just an event or events. That can be the impetus for these changes in our neurobiology. If we don't have an empathetic witness, we're more likely to be traumatized. People experience traumatic events all the time in life, but not everyone is traumatized by them. The body and mind, the emotional state, our capacity to relate to one another isn't always fundamentally changed for people. What appears to make the big difference is that sense of support and being witnessed or not at that time.
Thank you so much, Jane, for coming onto the podcast today. And so I'll dive straight into the question. So I'd firstly like to ask you, how would you define trauma, and why do you think it's so important to understand its impacts?
Okay, well, how I would describe it, I suppose, is maybe a little bit different than other people would. A lot of people these days refer to psychological trauma as though it's something that just occurs in the mind. But the way that I understand it is that it's an embodied experience. It's our whole body that can be impacted. So our physical body, our mind, our emotions, our nervous system can be impacted. And I suppose it's important to say as well that trauma isn't just an event or events. That can be the impetus for these changes in our neurobiology. But it's the event or events themselves is not what kind of causes the harm. That's what prompts the changes. And the changes occur usually most severely if we don't have adequate support around us. Gabor Mate uses a phrase, if we don't have an empathetic witness, we're more likely to be traumatized by whatever it is that happens. So that's important, I think, to say that people experience traumatic events all the time in life, but not everyone is traumatized by them. The body and mind, the emotional state, our capacity to relate to one another isn't always fundamentally changed for people. And what appears to make the big difference is that sense of support and being witnessed or not at that time that these things occur. So hopefully that is a little bit helpful to you in terms of giving you a sense of how I understand trauma.
Yeah, definitely. And what kind, for people who are listening, you might not know a lot about trauma, but what kind of types of trauma, what would you define as something that's traumatic? Like, what different types of trauma are there?
There's many types of events that can have an impact on us, that can have a negative impact, and particularly in the short term. So obviously there can be huge things. They sometimes refer to them as big T traumas. So for example, sexual violence or rape is a traumatic experience. It clearly is an embodied experience too. It shifts a person's sense of safety in the world and will make people typically on edge around other people, particularly of the gender that committed such a vicious assault on them. But there are other things, there are car crashes, which happen quite frequently, sadly. Warfare is traumatic. Explosions, we have wars in Gaza at the moment, in the Ukraine. That's traumatic for people to be experiencing. They don't always stop to think about it or process it at the given time because we're primed for survival. So that's all the body needs to do, is to survive what is occurring at the time. And sometimes then people will dissociate. So their minds and bodies will disconnect in order for them to live through the terrible event that's happening to them. But other things can be traumatic as well, so emotional neglect is something that I feel quite passionate about raising awareness of, because it's really common and it's poorly understood. And the way we rear boys and men, for example, is that they're allowed to have some emotions. They're allowed to be angry. They're not really allowed to be sad or to be soft or to be kind. We don't socialize boys and men that way. And girls are then, on the other hand, not meant to be angry. That's not ladylike. That's not okay. They're not meant to assert themselves. That's too mannish. It's off-putting. setting. So we put genders in these unfortunate boxes without knowing that emotions really are ways of communicating to us whether we feel safe around other people or not. And anger is a bodyguard emotion. If I'm angry with you for some reason, it's possibly because you've made me feel small, or you've hurt me in some way, and I want to defend myself against that. So it's an important message about our interaction and the health of our relationship. There's nothing fundamentally wrong with it, but it's problematic, of course, if I go around exploding in anger at people all the time and cannot contain it. That is problematic. But being fearful, fearful is also telling us about how we feel in the world. If I'm a black person in a room full of white people, I might feel very fearful of them for good reason, because of racism. Racism is an embodied trauma that's rampant. White supremacy has a huge harmful impact on lots of people. And poverty wouldn't necessarily be well understood as a trauma, but it's a massive stressor for people. So oftentimes people will have a lot of different overlapping, intersecting stressors. And then in the absence of this empathetic witness, they can actually be in quite an overwhelmed state in the world, where their nervous system is dysregulated a lot of the time. But also this medical trauma, Kyle, for example. So someone was talking to me the other day about a baby who had been hospitalized for life-saving treatment at the age of 5 months, and the parents couldn't really touch the baby. That's traumatic. It was a needed medical intervention, but the baby was then starved of contact. And also touch became maybe a fearful thing because doctors were touching her in order to save her, but the body was fearful and had no language for it, and maybe no memory for it either. So lots of traumas, if they occur in the first few years of life, are not remembered in an explicit way. We might have no language for them. If we're adopted, that is a visceral wound that people have. Again, that's poorly understood. And even where there's a lovely happy ending in the sense of a gorgeous loving family that a child goes to, there's that initial visceral attachment wound where there's the separation from the birth mother, often through no one's fault. It just wasn't able to proceed in the normal course of events. But that is something that can have lingering wounds for people well into adulthood, and can cause mental health challenges and addictions. And then the family around them don't understand where this is coming from, because they may have been very loving and caring, but still there's this implicit visceral wound, is the best way that I can kind of put it.
Yeah, I definitely agree. And I think, a lot of trauma and a lot of that contributes to, underlying maybe subconscious behaviors that, many people aren't even aware of. From my perspective, I actually am currently undergoing some EMDR therapy, which I've been talking about on my page, but I actually had an experience when I was very young, about 2 years old or so, and I was in a serious car accident. And I've always kind of remembered this car accident, very quite visceral images. I never really, until I started having this therapy, thought about maybe the impact that could have had on my life, and how not feeling safe that could have been carried through. So yeah, I think it is really interesting to look at these experiences, especially through childhood, and the impacts that they have on everyone as a society today.
Yeah, it's a great point. And I mean, it's counterintuitive, I think, to most people that what happens in our earliest years can have the most profound effect. But the first 1,000 days of our lives are the most significant in terms of just setting down a platform of safety or not safety in the world. And what you described there, a very frightening car crash, of course, could have an impact on anyone's nervous system, but yours was particularly young. Bruce Perry actually says, and Bruce Perry is a famous child psychiatrist and neuroscientist and author who's written multiple books, including with Oprah Winfrey, but he said the perinatal period, so the first 3 months of life, is actually the most significant. and that if you've 3 good months and then 16 bad years, where things go off the rails for some reason, you're more likely to have positive outcomes in adulthood than if the first 3 months for some reason are really impoverished and you don't get much serve and return interactions from your mom, or the caregiver is for some reason so highly stressed and in survival mode that they just can't attune to your needs. I think this is very fascinating, and it's very sad because we don't actually safeguard maternal health and well-being enough. In America, we send women back to work really, really quickly, and they don't have good benefits, so that's not good for their health, and it's certainly not good for child development either. In Ireland, we're not as bad as that. We do have decent paid maternity leave by comparison, but we have a sense that women belong in the workplace, should be always working. And in many ways, that's not the healthiest actually for child development. And it's not always great for the moms either, simply because you can't have it all. You can't do everything equally well. No, I wouldn't have wanted to spend my whole life rearing kids at home and doing nothing else. But my point is, we've one vision of what's the thing that should be done in the world, in the Western world now, and it's not necessarily always good for human development and functioning.
Well, definitely. And, you've only got to think, children are still developing as, when they're born, there's so much brain development going on. Imagine the amount of, everything that happens has an impact. When you're a child, you can't rationalize these things in the same way as you can as an adult. And I think people kind of forget that, the child doesn't maybe understand the world in the same way that we can and rationalize what happens.
No. And they viscerally need, I'm overusing this word, but what I mean by visceral is it's kind of in our guts, Our guts start screaming in a way if we don't get the right kind of care when we need it. And when we're tiny babies, all we really want is our birth mom, ideally. Now, the good news is that in order to survive, human babies are quite adaptable and they'll attach to anyone. In the wild or whatever, if the mom died and another woman or man came along, the baby would attach to that person, which is great. But the point is, they need someone to pick them up and hug them and kiss them and think they're the best thing in the world and cherish them. And that will get their neurons firing in a way that makes them believe, I am special, I am lovely, and other people are good, and I can trust most people. They're not out to harm me. And if you have that as your core kind of feeling about yourself and your core feeling about other people, you'll step out into the world with curiosity and able to play and make friends and collaborate and stuff like that. But if your default feeling is that, oh, I'm not safe, I'm not loved, people are shifty, they're dodgy, they're cruel, authority is abusive, that makes life very difficult, and it makes it hard to be good at school, to be a student who learns, and to be someone who can make friends and sustain them or have healthy, loving relationships as you get older. So yeah, it has an impact, much more than the general public and our politicians would like to believe.
Yeah, definitely. I think, trauma and, these adverse childhood experiences, as you say, have enormous impact on, everything from political to social to community level. So, I remember in your talk, you talked about, there's an ACE scoring system for, what can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Sure, yeah. The adverse childhood experiences studies are really very interesting. The first one came out in 1998. It was published then, rather, and it was a partnership by Kaiser Permanente, which was an insurance company in San Diego in California, and the Center for Disease Control in America, which people might have heard of during COVID because they were giving all the public health advice. And so the study looked at the health outcomes of around, I think it was 19,000 people, there or thereabouts. It was a good number of people who were mainly white, middle class, college educated people who could afford private health insurance in the States. And at that time, it was very expensive, so they were a privileged group. They were not prisoners. They were not people in, psychiatric units. But what they found was that adversities in childhood were really common. And by adversities, I mean things like emotional abuse, emotional neglect, physical abuse, sexual abuse, living with someone with a mental health problem, having an incarcerated relative, experiencing domestic violence, having a father beat the mother or that type of thing, having an addicted family member. So those experiences were very common, or having a separated parents also. And that one was actually put in there as a kind of proxy for parental strife. So parents fighting. And I know myself, my own parents used to fight a lot growing up, and it affected me. It affected how I felt, the stress level in the house. And I know it with my own children, when we're fighting, my husband and I are not getting on. No one likes it. It causes a deep level of discomfort. So I think that's really interesting, because parental strife is very common, whether or not people separate, and it dysregulates. So these things are really common. And what they found in that study was that there was a dose response. The more of them, the more adversities that people had, the more likely they were to develop heart disease or breathing problems or mental health challenges like depression and anxiety, or they were more likely to develop alcoholism. If someone had 4 or more ACEs, they were 1,200 times more likely to attempt suicide than someone who didn't have any. Like, that's a significant correlation there, where the distress level is so high if you have this accumulation of ACEs. And again, particularly, they weren't tracking this now in that original study, but in the absence of social supports. And because we're relational beings, and we can soothe one another through relationships. And a lot of the time that's just by listening. It's not doling out unwanted advice, but just sitting with someone. So those are very common, but actually there's loads of other adversities. I mentioned poverty before. That is an adversity. It's a massive stressor. And if you grow up in a poor community, or you're a person of color, you're more likely to have more ACEs. Subsequent studies have shown this. Women are more likely to have more ACEs than men. And it's not too surprising, because women are more likely to be sexually abused, although so are boys. Like, the prevalence of that is way higher than we might like to think. But also, if you grow up with sexual violence and domestic violence around you as a young girl, the danger is you're going to find yourself in that type of situation as well as an adult. So the cycle of violence continues in that regard. Also, in terms of the dose response, if you grow up in a household, let's say, with domestic violence and addiction in the household and mental health problems in the household, you're also probably more likely to maybe be verbally abused or physically abused. This is how things cluster. Yeah. If someone is unstable and self-medicating their own dysregulation, they're likely to be explosive in many ways and denigrating. It's not hard to see how these things can cluster. And it's very rare that you're just going to have domestic violence and no other adversities in the household. Yeah,
definitely. Like, as you were saying with poverty, there's so many things that come with poverty. There's the violence, is where you live, food scarcity, etc. All those things add up to a bigger picture, don't they?
Yes, and thank you for bringing me back to that point, because there's another lovely graphic and an article by Wendy Ellis and William Dietz about the pair of ACEs from 2018, I think it was, and that situates the individual and family adversities in this wider social context. And we have to bear that in mind all the time, because everything isn't equal in this. While adversity and trauma is very common, it's more common in some places than others. And when it clusters in poor communities, people have less resources in order to access help. They're maybe more distrusting of authority in general, because more people in the community have been harmed by systems and services. They don't necessarily believe that helping professionals really want to help them. They might feel they want to shame and blame them. And they're growing up with maybe violence outside their window, drug dealers outside their window, poor housing, poor social opportunities. And I think that's actually a big adversity as well. Like, growing up as a young person and thinking, I can't be anyone, I'm nobody. I've no chances of doing anything. I might as well just deal drugs, because then at least I can have nice clothes and I can be a big guy on campus in my community. So I think that kind of poverty of opportunity is very harmful in and of itself, along with all the other things.
Yeah, definitely. And, you're growing up also with that negative worldview where you've got all these experiences, you think nothing can get better. So that's already kind of shifting your own perceptions of reality in addition to all the other struggles.
Yeah, and when you don't see anyone around you going to university or going to work, it's like you have to see it to imagine that you can be it.
Yeah.
That's absolutely true. So it's really important to have Black doctors, ladies from all different walks of life in high office for young girls to be able to go, I could do that too. And as I say, we can't have everything, girls can't have everything, nor can guys for that matter, nor should we think that we can. And not everything is even worth pursuing. But I do think in order to have the imagination of potentially becoming something, you do need role models in that regard. Another thing I'd say, though, is the capacity to imagine anything is actually harmed by trauma. Bessel van der Kolk says imagination and creativity are kind of stomped out a little bit sometimes in some people. Now, other traumatized people, of course, can be wildly creative and create beautiful works of art as a way of processing what they've been through. But oftentimes people literally cannot hope for a better future. They can't imagine, particularly if they're poor and traumatized, they can't imagine ever getting out of the dark hole that they're in. And in those type of circumstances, then drugs and alcohol are going to be really attractive because they're an attempt at a solution, as Vincent Felitti says. It is a choice initially to, I'll try this. But then their dysregulated nervous system finds that, there's a little bit of relief here.
Yeah.
And Felitti also says it's hard to get enough of something that doesn't quite work. So really what people are trying to do if they start really taking drugs too often or drinking in a very excessive way, that it's not just having a pleasant drink, once or twice a week, it's getting blotto and getting out of control. That is in a way trying to do something to the nervous system that is dysregulated. But it obviously is dangerous and unhealthy over time to rely on something like that. And it doesn't work. It doesn't make the pain go away. It distracts you for a little while.
Yeah, it's just like a ritualistic, comfort-seeking behavior.
Yes.
It may work in the short term, but in the long term, it comes with negative consequences.
Yeah, and one of my favorite articles during my PhD was about this doctor called Daniel Sumrock, who is an addiction specialist. And he said, becoming addicted to drugs or alcohol after a pile of aces is a normal, predictable response. It's almost like you're stabbed and you bleed. It's that normal and predictable. The more aces you have, the more likely you are to self-medicate in this regard. So he kind of suggested that we rename addiction as ritualized compulsive comfort seeking. It's not the easiest thing to say, but it makes a lot of sense to me because it is a ritualized behavior and it is essentially about having an increased level of comfort in the body and in the world around other people.
Yeah, and so going on from that, what is your opinion on the war on drugs when it comes to, in terms of, people who are addicted?
Yeah, in my opinion on this has really shifted over the years. When I was younger, I knew nothing about this. I was afraid of drugs. I believed all the narrative that they were dangerous and they were evil and, probably that it was a good thing to have them all banned and made illegal. I now have a very different view on this. I think the war on drugs has been a resounding failure. It hasn't protected the most vulnerable from the evils of them. No, I'm not saying that they can't be potentially harmful, but I think trauma and poverty and racism are way more harmful than the intrinsic properties of the drugs. I think our social inequity, our waging a war primarily on the traumatized poor is quite brutal, actually. And the tells us now that in some cases, some of these substances can be quite helpful in a therapeutic process. So there is a lot of good research being done now on psychedelic assisted psychotherapy, for example, or in Australia, psilocybin, magic mushrooms have been legalized for use in depression. And I think in a few years' time, we might be in a different space where we're not as rigid in this belief that all drugs are harmful to all people all the time. And the evidence simply isn't there. Lots of people try drugs and they do not get addicted to them. Why is that? If the drug itself is intrinsically addictive, everyone should get addicted to it the first time they try it, and that's not happening. So some people are more susceptible to addiction than others. And people like the chap who did the rat park experiments, I can't think of his name now, Bruce something or other, and Gabor Mate anyway will say, the common denominator in addiction is usually trauma, that there is this pain that people are trying to do something with. And polydrug use can become part of that, where you maybe take heroin or some sort of opioid to make the pain go away, but then you might want to come up and feel a bit lively and feel alive. So you might try other kind of amphetamines and then need other tablets to go to sleep. But really, it's still all about modulating your arousal in the world and not ever feeling at ease in your body. So yeah, my view is that the war on drugs basically is cruel and is trauma blind and is costing a fortune. Our prisons across the world are full of traumatized poor people who have used drugs and alcohol to cope. And sometimes have done violent acts, but for the most part, it can be drug-related theft or possession for sale and supply. And I'm not convinced it has yielded any really positive outcomes. There's a lot of people employed in it in our prisons and policing, and there's a never-ending kind of desire for altered states of consciousness.
Yeah, 100%. And I think, sending people for, minor drug offences to jail, that's just going to lead to even more traumatization of the individual. And, that's just going to create a further negative cycle. And I think that if the money that was spent on the war on drugs was invested into education and healthcare and awareness, then, we wouldn't really have the same kind of problem.
Yeah, and also to go back to the original point, into supporting moms and maternal health, and just taking some of the stress of parenthood away. More investment in just building healthy relationships as well. Like education in schools is grand, and teaching people, a bit about emotional regulation is all great and well, but a lot of places are too behavior focused and they're not understanding that behavior is communication. There's a lot of distressed people out there. There's a lot of anxious, depressed children. And why is this? I mean, the internet as well is not always healthy. I think you asked me at the talk in Manchester about, people online and trauma dumping and this, that, and that's one phenomenon. People can find one another online and try and seek witnesses and validation for the terrible things they've encountered. But also for young girls, like the internet is absolutely full of girls going on about looks and their bodies and are they nice enough, and young men then being exposed to versions of masculinity that really are not good for them. They might seem glamorous, the Tates might seem like they're having the best life and they've all these women, but it's very abusive. It is quite a toxic version of manhood, and I don't even like that phrase actually, but it's quite a traumatized and traumatizing version of manhood. And when we're all then a bit disconnected and parents don't know whether they're coming or going, they're busy, they're stressed, we're leaving the parenting of our young people to the internet, and my kids watch a lot of YouTube and they'd be talking to me about these things. I don't know what they are. I don't know what the words mean. It's kind of a little bit frightening actually, in ways. So education is important, but connecting in the real world and listening and really tuning into each other enough of the time and noticing if people seem different and dysregulated, and sometimes asking uncomfortable questions, like, how are you? And being willing to actually hear when people tell you they're feeling really fragile and don't know what to do next, or they're having bad thoughts. I think we need to be able to ask those questions and fear maybe being a bit rude almost, because it's better to ask than not.
Yeah, definitely.
And then have something terrible happen.
Yeah. And I think parts of the problem comes down to, I think, well, especially in my opinion, is there's a lack of community in the sense of an in-person community, especially in the Western world. There's a lot of hyper individualism, and there's not really that same support. Everybody is living in their own house. There isn't this community sense where people can kind of rely on each other easily. There's kind of a disconnect between people.
It's such an important point, Kyle. I wear my Ubuntu jumper when I do my talks a lot these days, and Ubuntu is a phrase from Africa about how I am because we are. And it's a really lovely one. Bessel van der Kolk and others talk about it as well. This intersubjectivity, this interconnectedness of human beings. And it's like, there would be no me without you and without other people, or I wouldn't need to know my boundaries and what makes me different, aside from me being female and you male and living in different countries and all of different experiences. But the I in the interaction only makes sense when there's other people. And I do think the world has become more complicated. The internet, social media, working online, it's very handy, but it has disconnected us a lot from our natural instincts, and we need to be in person more often. We need to have meetings in person more often. We need to have fun with one another more often. And like, your idea of fun might not be the same as my idea of fun, but we need to find people who we can have fun with. Joy is vitally important. We can't be joyful all the time, of course. And this is the whole thing. It's fine to feel sad, but we also need to find ways of getting ourselves out of the funk and moving our bodies as part of that. I think you're involved with music as well. Music is a great thing. Dancing is a fantastic thing for the nervous system. And women in general have a bit more access to dancing than men in the West. In Africa now, and in indigenous cultures, men dance and they love it, and it's not a girly thing. It's just a body thing, and the energy flows. And we just need to find ways of being in groups in safe, fun ways, and sitting around the place the whole time on our phones scrolling, or watching too much kind of content that is just repeating what we already think and feel and making us fearful of other people. It's very bad for our mental health, and it's very bad for the state of the planet, and it's just negative in terms of our openness to one another, I think. So for sure, being in person is I think a very good thing. Obviously now the tribal nature of the way humans are built a little bit can mean that we will feel safer and more comfortable with some people than others. But ultimately, the only way of kind of counteracting some fear-driven behavior is actually to get to know other people, and then we actually discover, while there are cultural differences and there are gender differences and things like that, we're all essentially the same. We need the same things. We need to be safe. We need to be healthy. We need connection. We need meaning and purpose and belonging. And all the rest of the stuff is not that important. I mean, yes, cultural differences, I have great respect for cultural differences, but it doesn't separate me fundamentally from someone else, because we are essentially at our core more similar than we are different.
Definitely. Talking about, different cultures and taking it back to trauma and how, trauma can be more common in different cultural groups. And, this is linking to generational trauma. And why is it that, some groups, their trauma seems to pass down from generation to generation? How does that work?
Well, it works in a variety of ways. Epigenetics looks at how gene expression kind of occurs. And for groups, let's say, like survivors of the Holocaust, as we know, that was a terrible, brutal, vicious time in history where Jewish people and other groups were almost exterminated by the Nazis, put in concentration camps. Many died in horrendous conditions, and a small number survived and, let's say, went to the States or came to England or went to other countries. So then a lot of their family might have died and they might have been the only survivor. Their nervous system could not ever be the same as what it was before that. You know, if you just think about trying to survive and still have faith in human beings when you saw this horror all around you and were living with the very real fear of maybe dying yourself, and then maybe the guilt of surviving. So your nervous system has been reset. You get married, possibly to another survivor, and you may or may not talk about those dark times all the time, but you are different to the person that you were before. You are probably a lot more fear-driven, whether consciously or unconsciously, than you were before. Your sense of belief in the goodness of human beings probably has been quite ruptured. Now, maybe not. Maybe you still really believe that people are good. But your body has changed and your energy has changed. And then you maybe have some children in a foreign country and you're struggling with poverty and the normal relational stresses and strains. And you mightn't just be very tuned in to affection all that much because, you know, you have had such experiences. And then, you know, your children grow up and they become parents themselves. They get married, and some of these relational patterns get passed on. Now, this is the same really for all human beings, whether or not they survived something outrageous like the Holocaust. We inherit relational patterns unless we become conscious of them and we try and break them.
Mm.
So if we know that we need to be very attuned as parents and we need to kiss and hug our babies a lot, or if we've experienced that kind of care ourselves, we're likely to do it. But if we haven't experienced it ourselves, we're not likely to do it necessarily unless we become aware of how important it is. So that's one way that patterns can be transmitted, is attuned caregiving or fairly blank caregiving, where you're still meeting basic needs, but not this real relational attunement part that's crucial. The other way, though, is in this dialed up stress response system, where if you've survived something horrendous like that, or slavery, so let's say you were transported from Africa on a ship, plucked from your land and brought across the water for several months, and then sold into chattel slavery, separated from your wife and your children, and you then are beaten and dehumanized day in, day out, that is going to have an impact on you fundamentally as a person and how you view white people and how you view yourself in the world. And generations later, it can have an impact on how Black people in the here and now are parenting their children. For example, harsh parenting can make sense if you think about how hundreds of years before, it was better for the slave driver not to notice your children, really. You know, attention was better than negative attention for bad behavior. And I said this at a talk recently, and it made real sense to a woman who was African American, was kind of going, she was told as a young girl not to let her blackness show almost in her behavior as a small child, which is a very harsh thing to kind of hear. But it makes sense almost epigenetically, not that people would be consciously thinking of this as anything to do with what happened on plantations hundreds of years ago. But people like Oprah Winfrey as well, in her book with Bruce Perry, talks about choosing the switch to be lashed with when she was a small girl. And just Joy DeGruy as well. She's written a great book about post-traumatic slave syndrome and just how many of these perplexing behaviors at times that can be witnessed among African Americans are largely due to unprocessed embodied trauma that their forefathers and mothers experienced, that there was no opportunity to digest and work through. There was no mass EMDR or breath work or any other intervention offered to anyone. And so things can show up in the here and now that are harmful in the here and now, but were maybe adaptive at one time for survival, if you get me. So
definitely.
that's part of the intergenerational transmission of problem behaviors, is that they once had a function, but that function has long been lost or forgotten. And in the here and now, it's just destructive.
Yeah. So stuff that this learned behavior is passed on in a sense, because it's just seen as what you do, but without really understanding what the reason was in the first place. But now it doesn't have any impact or any reason, just negative outcomes.
It's just an example of it. And another fabulous book on this type of phenomenon in the American context is by Resmaa Menakem, My Grandmother's Hands, it's called, and how healing needs to occur through the body in relation to white supremacy and how that has had an impact on Black bodies, but also, Black bodies can also be fearful of themselves, including sometimes in the policing context in the States. There can be more fear by police officers, as we all know, of young Black men than white men. And it may or may not have any justification, but his whole concept is the only way we can truly heal this is through the body. It's not through unconscious bias training necessarily, because it's our bodies that tell us whether we feel safe or not in the world. And we can have these automatic, very damaging responses if we don't tune into them more. So it's a really intriguing way to think of this. And not only to think of it, because obviously thinking only gets us so far. It's learning to tune into our nervous systems and to notice when we're activating one another, and to sit with discomfort some of the time and notice our hearts racing and notice the fear rising, not just in this context, but in many contexts, but particularly where now we're entering a very strange era again with the new Trump presidency, and the sort of the impact that will have on so many people, on women, on minorities, and the fact that I guess his mandate was strong enough, where white people voted for him in high numbers. So what impact that will have on racial dynamics, it's kind of rather frightening to me, I have to say.
Definitely. Yeah. And, it kind of gives power to those people who did vote, and things will just cycle from there. If people feel that, they were right, it just goes to show hate crime increases, violence against women increases, all these things.
And the thing about it is, you can only really heal trauma when it's past. So this racial trauma is going to be ongoing. A lady asked me about this in the audience in Liverpool, and I was saying, I really hope Kamala will win, because the outcome will be better all around, I felt, than this verdict for people. But you can't heal from white supremacy as it's escalating. You can't heal from misogyny when it's right in your face and it's on the increase, and when access to abortion is going to be clamped down on. So it's quite a depressing and frightening prospect, actually, where lots of different types of embodied trauma are going to be amplified, I think. So, in terms of mass healing at that stage, it's hard to see how it can happen. But I do think the more people who are tuned in to their own selves and their families and trying to make positive inroads energetically for themselves, it does have a bit of a ripple effect. And also being mindful of the struggles of others, when they are encountering people who are really being harmed by policies, whether in England or Ireland or elsewhere, to just be mindful of the fact that not everyone is impacted by these policies equally.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, because some people think, oh, why do you have an issue? It's not going to affect you, but you got to think about all the other people that it might affect. It's not just you living in the world. There's so many other people with different needs and different experiences.
And that brings us back to the interconnected part, really, because if we don't care about the well-being of others, it is actually going to impact us
Mm.
because there will be increased crime. There will be increased mental health problems. There will be higher suicide rates. There will be more people overdosing. And I do think that matters. They are people's children and family members, and it costs us a lot of money to neglect people, actually.
Talking more about, the adverse childhood experiences. So how does that, we touched on it briefly, with trauma and, its impact on crime. But how does that intersect with the criminal justice system? And should we be looking at how we charge people for the crimes depending on trauma?
Yeah, great question. Well, I suppose this is how I stumbled into this whole area, really, as such a massive fascination of mine at this stage. I did my PhD starting in 2015, and I was looking at long sentence male prisoners who were subject to some form of post-release supervision in Ireland. And I was co-funded by the Probation Service, who I now work for, and the Irish Research Council. And, at that time, I suppose I knew that most people who commit crimes are poor. They're nearly always men, like 90% across the world are men. They are poor and they have often got addictions and poor school leaving and, early school leaving, intergenerational unemployment. So the sort of social context of offenders was known to me. But what I didn't really know, although it wasn't also that surprising to me, was just what difficult lives people have in terms of abuse and neglect and violence and addiction and suicidal parents and that type of thing. Again, I possibly had an inkling, but it wasn't written enough about in everything that I'd read up until that point, really. Was stuff around maybe poor parental supervision, but that doesn't really capture sexual abuse, physical abuse, emotional neglect quite so much, or the impact of domestic violence. I think I knew about that in a way, but I didn't really know about it, if you get me. I didn't know how it can shift the brain and body and make you so terrified to be in the world as a small child. And so when I was interviewing the 12 men, the prisoners who were nearing release, most of them very quickly told me something that made me just kind of sit up a bit more and kind of go, what would I be like under different circumstances? It's not like I'm fabulous now or anything like that, but I've a lot of privilege. I was doing a PhD. I had family who loved me, a lot of people believing in me. But I'd be very different under different circumstances. If I grew up in poor communities like them, I might well be using a pile of drugs myself, for example. I might have been a teen mom or whatever. So I just started doing a lot of trauma trainings then and reading more on this kind of field and looking at more of the ACE studies, because there were ACE studies in the context of offender populations, including women, to do with mental health problems, suicide risk, experience of domestic violence, but also among men. If they had a higher level of adversity, they were more likely to be a violent offender or to develop a serious addiction. And really, it's no surprise, I don't think, is it, Kyle? When you think about it, it's not really that much of a surprise that if you clock up 8 or 9 or 10 ACEs, and then you also experience racism and maybe the care system, how are you meant to be well? Like, how are you meant to function in the world? How are you meant to learn? How are you meant to achieve anything? It's an achievement to be just standing. It's an achievement to not be a super violent offender, I think, actually. And the more adversities you have and the more fearful you are in the world, the more likely you are to be violent, because you can't see people the way other people see them. You can't see another man if you're a male without thinking he might kill me. So better to kill him instead, or better to get in there first, So I think we fundamentally need to look at this differently and develop therapies and interventions that are way more compassionate and relational, and see that people are victims as well as perpetrators, because you can't have 10, 12, 15 ACEs and not be a victim too, and not be a victim of serious crimes. This is the point. Many people, if they've been a victim of physical abuse and sexual abuse and domestic violence exposure as a child, those are all serious crimes, but
yeah.
They are actually serious crimes, but no one is held accountable for them oftentimes. So they're victim perpetrators, and they deserve a better service provided to them. Society also deserves a better service to be provided to them, because if we're serious about trying to break the cycle of crime, then we need to help people find tools other than drugs and alcohol to help them survive. We need to release people into conditions where they're not terrified, where they relapse as soon as they get out. And that means access to some stable housing a lot of the time, or maybe moving people out of communities that are riven with drugs. Because if I was coming out and I had managed to go into recovery, but I was terrified of going back home, I can see how I would be very susceptible to relapsing, and benzodiazepines, in particular in Ireland, they're a big thing. They act on the fear centers of the brain. So why are people so fearful? Well, they're fearful because they've had all these traumatic experiences, and they're trying to dampen down their arousal again, so there's so many ways that I think the system is trauma blind, and it's not good enough because it's a very expensive system. If we're actually going to try and rehabilitate people, I think we need to prioritize some body-based interventions and train all staff in the importance of, trauma responsive care, where it's so important to engage with people as human beings and to have hope for them, no matter what they've done. And no matter how broken in terms of the accumulation of adversities that they might seem, there is always hope, I do think, and the hope sometimes can be hard for the individual to feel themselves. So this is where the ACE score calculator might be risky. If we actually count all the ACEs someone might have, we might decide, oh no, we can't work with them. They're just too broken. And that would be harmful, because then you're giving up, and that's not good enough. But it will probably mean that the person, if they've a huge number of adversities, is going to be more difficult to work with. It will take longer. They won't trust you as easily. They won't be as nice. They won't be smiley. The eye contact might be a bit iffy. They might have hostile body language. They might jump off the deep end with minor provocation. But that's all because their nervous system has been in a chronic state of defense. And if we can give them some tools that might help them settle the nervous system, well, people do change.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah.
But it can be slower, and it can be a few steps forward and several steps back. And I think that needs to be accepted. And patience
definitely
is important.
Yeah, and this is you might think this is a very strange question, but have you ever seen like a program on TV called like Dogs Behaving Badly? Well, okay, you can imagine what it's about. On these kind of programs, get this dog and it's behaving badly, funnily enough, and these programs are, oh, it's not a bad dog. It's this dog has just had all these traumatic experiences. It's scared. It's barking because it's scared, but when you look at the media and how people talk about people, they think, oh, that's just that person's just bad. How could they do all these things? But then, as you say, if you look at all this trauma and all these experiences that they had, is it really entirely their fault that they're that way? And no, in the same way as the dog, no. And yeah,
no, it's a really good point, because often we are more empathetic towards animals in distress than we would be to human beings in distress. And I think, again, it's like we condemn offenders often for lack of empathy, right? It's a very frequent thing that's said. They haven't any empathy for their victims, or they haven't cared about, the cost of this to someone else in terms of violating their human rights and this, that, and the other. But we're not always good at feeling empathy for people who don't seem to be like us. And the thing is, we actually don't know what we'd be like under different circumstances. If we've a lot of privilege, we just can't imagine ourselves, behaving that way. Not all boys and men have to become as violent in the world as some boys and men. Like, I don't believe safe, happy boys carry knives. Why would they? They don't need to. They don't feel unsafe enough to have to carry a knife. You know, they know they can walk around and feel fairly safe and secure in the fact that people aren't just going to assault them. Some boys and men don't have that sense in the world because from the time they've been tiny, they have been hit and beaten and verbally abused. And that's what they go into the world thinking is going to happen. And then they become quite dangerous, some of them themselves, because they're too quick in terms of their reflexes and have no impulse control. And that, you know, we need to attend to that. Like, we do need to try and rein in those violent impulses. But they're not just generally, I don't think, violent impulses. They're survival-oriented responses that have a self-protective function most of the time rather than just randomly attacking people. So yeah, I do think it would be nice if society had a bit more of a sense of the village, that we're responsible for one another, that, you know, I, as a taxpayer, as a mom, have also responsibilities to other people's children, and I don't want to see them growing up homeless and abused and think that I'm going to have good outcomes for those children. It's not going to happen. So we do need to care more about other people's children. And for the parents who are not doing a great job of it, like, they were children once too. So we need to help with parents who are struggling more in a non-shaming, non-blaming relational way as well, and give them hope that they can be the best that they can be as well. And I do believe with the right type of supports, people can change massively. But if they're made to feel like they are dirt and worthless, why would they access the help and support that you're offering? Why would they go near it? I wouldn't myself.
Yeah, the shame that I guess goes along with it. Yeah, exactly. So in terms of, you know, addressing trauma on a societal level, is there anything that gives you hope, or any changes that you think are positive?
Yeah, well, I do think there is more interest in understanding individual trauma and family trauma and collective trauma. I do, you know, in the talks that I've given in Ireland and the few in the UK recently, people have an appetite for understanding themselves and being healthier. And there was a group in Liverpool, the Ubuntu group, who wanted to understand how to try and heal on an intergenerational level as well. I think people like Thomas Hubel are doing work around collective trauma as well. If more of us try and become more healthy and whole and less judgmental of others and more compassionate for ourselves, and try and be more of a positive influence in the world. Now, we're not going to ever be perfect. We are going to get things wrong. I think the more people who learn about trauma and try and bring in trauma-informed practices organizationally, that will be beneficial. But it's not just doing a 2-hour course, ticking boxes and not changing anything about ourselves. To go back to the relational side of things, I need to feel you a bit. Like, if you're in distress, I need to be able to sit with you in that a bit more. You know, if I'm a social worker, again, I need to listen to what people are telling me. What do they need? What are they actually saying to me, rather than me saying, well, Kyle, I think it's this. You know, the idea politically of sending job coaches into psychiatric units is daft beyond belief. It's so trauma blind as well, because that's not what people need at that moment. It's not going to help them. So we need to all learn a bit more about the brain and the body and the nervous system and state-dependent functioning, how none of us are at our best when we're stressed and overwhelmed. We're not compassionate. We're not empathetic. You know, I wouldn't be caring all that much about other people's children if I was really overwhelmed myself in the here and now.
Yeah.
You know, if I'm very stressed, my compassion departs, and that's natural and normal. But more of us need to try and stay as safe and regulated as we can as much of the time. And some of that is down to the individual, in the sense of finding what works for me to keep myself as regulated as I can be. So, like, doing a regular yoga practice, sometimes taking a break from my family and having some time to myself, and just able to enjoy life without the day-to-day burdens and stresses that family life can have. So time out can be important, space to breathe. I find holotropic breath work and things like this really good as well. And so there's a growing number, I definitely think, of people who don't want the world to continue in this way, who want to realize and greatly do realize when you go to some of these group healing events, like there's a lovely feeling of connection in them that you mightn't have with people who a whole pile more, so we can really connect with one another in quite an intense and deep way. And then we mightn't see each other ever again. But I think that's actually a very beautiful thing to tune into. And even with the holotropic breathwork, the more transpersonal side of things, we are so small and insignificant as individuals, really. That's quite a good thing to understand at times, because we can feel so consumed by ourselves and our worries, but we're like specks of dust in the universe in one way. And to take a little bit of joy in smaller things and to wonder at nature, and those are good things for all of us to try and cultivate. And that's, again, not to minimize our own individual suffering at times, but it's to get a bit of perspective and to be in awe at times of the beauty in the world, and be in awe sometimes of the beauty in other people, when they're sharing something magnificent or some little bit of healing that they've found. That's a really lovely thing to witness for me, and to see people shift energetically is a beautiful thing to witness. So I am hopeful, actually, Kyle. I think it's a dark time in some ways, but in other ways, I think loads of us are fed up and are
Yeah.
trying to make things better for ourselves, for those we love. And you know what? Actually, love, what I've discovered is it does have an infinite capacity. I feel much more loving to people in general now than I did years ago. And I think that's wonderful. It might sound a bit cheesy, but it's actually true that, I can feel loving towards strangers. I don't love them exactly as I love my children, but I do want good things for them.
Yeah,
I want
definitely.
them to be safe and well. And I think if more of us feel that way about one another, that can only be a good thing.
Definitely. Yeah, that's really, really a good point. And as well, I think you're looking from the individual level. I think a lot of people, as you say, in the grand scheme of things, each person isn't really having that much of an impact, but you can still have big impact on other people just from the small things that you do every day. I try now. If you can say one thing to someone, that can stay with someone for the rest of their life. So I think you can still have a massive impact on other people's well-being, even if you might not think so.
For sure.
Yeah.
For sure. And I think if we are intentionally trying to have more of, I think it's Karen Traceman calls them sparkle moments or glimmer moments,
Yeah.
that we can bring little small moments of joy. And I interviewed a guy, Rob Balfour, recently. He spoke of islands of hope. We might never know if we've been an island of hope for someone, but much better to try and do that, to be a positive energetic source if someone encounters you, than a source of wounding or harm. And again, we will get it wrong sometimes. Even with all the knowledge in the world, we won't equally be therapeutic or lovely all of the time. But I think if we just consciously strive to do a bit more of that, then we're more likely to do it than if we're just kind of like, no, it's all about me and my patch. And I just can't pay attention to anyone else. I don't have the energy for it ever. Well, those type of people are less likely, I would say, to bring hope and joy to others. But they still might, unbeknownst to themselves. But I do think if we consciously strive for it, we're more likely to actually manage it.
And so, just a last question to wrap up, which would be, if someone listening today, they've experienced some sort of trauma, what would you say to them?
Well, one, I would say they're not alone. Many people, probably most people, have experienced some level of trauma, whether at the relational level, which is the most common, in some ways most harmful kind, but it can be healed, and it's healed in relationships. So I would try and, I suppose, encourage people to have hope for themselves, that things can be better and easier, that they can feel more at ease in their body. And that's what I would wish for them. That's what I wish for myself in my daily life, is just to feel more at ease in my body, calmer and more content in my body. Because if that happens, you'll feel more calm and content in your mind and in your emotions as well, and more open and more expansive. If you don't trust other people, I would hope that you can build trust, that you can connect with yourself first, because where people have poor attachment experiences, you can build a secure attachment to yourself. Sometimes that will be through a therapist, engaging with a good therapist and telling some of your story. And the telling of a story and having someone witness it can be really beneficial. But I would also say, if the body is feeling all tense and kind of gnarly, maybe try some body work. It could be energy psychology like tapping, or some sort of breath work, or EMDR like you mentioned, Kyle. There's a range of things out there. Don't be discouraged if the first thing doesn't work. The deeper the trauma, the more you're going to have to work for the ease. It won't come as easy as if it's a smaller type of trauma. If the trauma is ongoing, you can't actually fully heal from it because you're in survival mode. So if you're only in survival mode because you're currently experiencing something, that's normal. Okay, so you just need to get through that. But I've met loads of wonderful people who've had trauma experiences, and they're using them and that knowledge to help other people. And even if they're not doing it professionally, they're trying to break the cycle for their children. And some of that is just owning what has happened, apologizing for the mistakes and the bits that you can't take back, but pledging to make yourself as happy and whole and safe and connected as you can be. That's a great benefit for future generations too, So, yeah, go well is what I would say. And yeah, I hope for ease in the body, really.
Yeah, great. Thank you so much, Jane, for coming onto the podcast today. It's been such a pleasure to hear all of your insights.
Thank you, Kyle. It was a great honor. Lovely to reconnect.